The room smelled like recycled air and decisions already made, and not one person in it looked up when she walked in. Thessin had attended 11 diplomatic briefings in the past 4 months. She had been told this would be the 12th. The Quelvar Dominion had already killed 12 billion humans by the time she arrived at Threnic Deep, and the 41 red circles on the tactical display told her, though she did not yet understand it, that humanity had decided what to do about that. She had 47 days left on her assignment rotation. Within the hour, that number would stop mattering. 14 months later, sitting at a desk on a neutral station with a report she could not finish, she would write that the strangest part was not what she learned in that room. The strangest part was that no one offered her a seat. What Vale Korath launched in that room, what the Terran Covenant built and deployed while the official government drafted surrender terms, she would spend the rest of her career trying to find language for it. She never did. What she found instead was one sentence. She almost deleted it. She did not. But that comes later. What Vale launched had a name. What the machines did next had no name that fit. Stay with me, because what the Quelvar Dominion did not understand about humans, what it could not have understood, given 11,000 years of watching other species comply, is the part that still keeps me up at night. 3 months before Thessin walked into that room, every screen on every human colony world went live at the same moment. The Quelvar Dominion had been governing galactic civic space for longer than humanity had written language. Their administrative processes had the specific patience of institutions that do not expect to be challenged. When they wanted something, they did not negotiate first. They demonstrated first. The demonstration was brief. 12,400,000,000 people died in 11 days. Humans watched it happen. The broadcast was transmitted simultaneously to every colony, every station, every ship in human space in a format compatible with every screen humanity had built. The Dominion had done their research. They wanted everyone to see it clearly. The voice that delivered the ultimatum was calibrated to carry across 17 different species hearing ranges without distortion. It was neither warm nor cold in the way a human voice is warm or cold. It was simply precise. It named the terms. It named the deadline. It gave humanity 47 days to accept tributary status, surrender military vessels, abandon all colonies beyond the home system, and provide 1 million humans per year for imperial service. That last phrase, 1 million per year for service. The official human government convened an emergency session within 6 hours. The session produced a subcommittee. The subcommittee produced an agenda. The agenda produced, over the following 3 weeks, a framework for preliminary negotiations. The surrender committee had a name. It had subcommittees. It had chairs and vice chairs and working groups dedicated to drafting the language of compliance. The committee was not the story. The story was in a decommissioned ore processing installation beneath the northern ice shelf of a moon called Threnic Deep, where the walls still carried the painted stencils of a mining company that had gone out of business before the broadcast. The air inside smelled of cold metal and recycled nitrogen, and very faintly, the hydraulic fluid that had once run the heavy lift machinery before it was stripped out and replaced with something else entirely. Vale Korath had chosen Threnic Deep because it was listed in 7 separate bureaucratic databases as inactive. The power draw was registered as residual, a common artifact of equipment decommissioning, nothing worth investigating. The Dominion surveillance systems, which were thorough and sophisticated and completely unprepared for the specific shape of the problem they were about to face, saw nothing in the facility that registered as a military concern. They were not wrong. What they failed to understand was that the difference between a supply chain and a weapons network was a decision, not a design. Vale had spent 14 years building supply chains. He knew exactly which bolt connects to which pipe, which power routing looks like or processing infrastructure from a sensor pass at altitude, and which production manifests can be filed under mining equipment without triggering a compliance flag. He had not set out to learn how to hide a war machine inside a civilian framework. He had set out to move grain across 40 colony installations efficiently and cheaply. It turned out the skills were the same. He was reviewing a casualty manifest the morning Thessin arrived, or let me get this right, he reviewed one every morning. He had begun on the day the broadcast ended and had not stopped. The manifest contained the names and last known locations of every person confirmed dead across the 11 days of the Dominion's demonstration. It was not complete. It would never be complete. He read it anyway every morning before he looked at anything else. The operations binder sat to his left. It was a physical document, paper, spiral-bound, the kind of thing a logistics coordinator uses to track procurement schedules and production targets. He had written one number inside the front cover on the first day and had not looked at it since. 12,400,000,000. It was enough to know it was there. Thessin would later write that she first saw Vale Korath from across a converted equipment bay, standing at a desk that had probably once been used to log ore shipments. He was reading. He did not look up when she entered any more than the others had. She noted the operations binder. She noted that it was closed. She noted that he kept his left hand flat on the cover of it while he read, the way a person keeps a hand on something they are not looking at but are not willing to put down. She did not know what the binder contained. She would not learn for several weeks. When she did learn, she understood why his hand had stayed there. The room held 11 people, not politicians, not diplomats. Thesson recognized the rank markings on Admiral Preth Vorn from reference materials she had studied during her assignment briefing. He was standing at the far wall, looking at the tactical display. He had a handwritten list in his left hand. She could see the ink on it, the small, neat rows of text, and he was not reading it. He was holding it the way Vale was holding the binder, as though it were something that needed to be kept close. She would learn later that the list contained the name of every ship Admiral Vorn had converted from civilian use to weapons platform since the Covenant began. He added a name each time a conversion was completed. He crossed nothing off. The woman seated at the central workstation was introduced to Thesson briefly, by function rather than name. She was the lead designer of the Anathema Protocol. Dr. Yenna Sale had not slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 6 weeks, and she did not look like someone who had not slept enough. She looked like someone who had decided that sleep was a resource she was not currently allocating. Her coffee cup was full and cold. She had not drunk from it. She was reading something on her screen, and she was completely still in the way people become still when the thing they are reading requires the entire body to process it. Thesson noted the 41 red circles on the tactical display. She did not ask what they were. She had learned in 11 months of diplomatic work that the question you most want to ask is usually the one you should wait on. She took her seat at the back of the room. She placed her recorder on the armrest. She waited. She would be waiting for 6 hours before she understood what the circles meant. The Quelvar Dominion had given humanity 47 days. What the Dominion surveillance teams reported back during those 47 days was consistent and unremarkable. Elevated commercial traffic between human colony systems, increased mining operations in several asteroid belts, research station activity consistent with materials science and structural engineering, the kind of work a species might undertake when planning to build new habitat structures. Long-range sensor passes showed shipyard activity, but the vessels under construction were small, roughly the dimensions of ore carriers and survey drones. Compliance speed industrial activity looks identical to submission speed industrial activity if you are not checking what is being produced. The Dominion was not checking what was being produced. They were watching the human government's official channels, and what those channels showed was exactly what the Dominion expected. A species in the process of accepting that it had lost. The Surrender Committee was still meeting. The subcommittees were still drafting. The preliminary framework for tributary status negotiations was 42 pages long and had been revised 11 times. Below the surface of that activity, running on civilian communication frequencies using commercial code phrases that the Dominion's intelligence systems categorized as shipping logistics, the Terran Covenant was coordinating the largest weapons manufacturing program in human history. There were 31 people in the Covenant when it began: logistics coordinators, industrial engineers, fleet commanders whose careers had been in survey and transport, not combat. One weapons theorist from the Lunar Research Institute who had spent 6 years building a self-replicating construction system for deep space habitat assembly, and who had, 11 days after the broadcast, realized that the architecture was transferable. Dr. Yenna Sale had presented her initial proposal to Vale Korath using a single sheet of paper and 11 minutes of quiet, precise explanation. She had not used the word weapon. She had used the word architecture. The difference was meaningful to her. Vale had listened without interrupting. At the end of 11 minutes, he had asked 2 questions. The first was, "Can it be recalled?" Yenna had said, "Yes." If the termination codes are entered before the primary directive initiates full network propagation. The second question was, "How long does that window last?" Yenna had paused for exactly 3 seconds before answering. 72 hours from first deployment contact. Vale had nodded. He had picked up his coffee. He had finished it. He had set the cup down and said, "Show me the production requirements." That meeting was not recorded in any official document. Thesson would reconstruct it 14 months later from the testimony of 3 people who were present, all of whom remembered it slightly differently, all of whom agreed on 2 things: that Vale Korath had not hesitated, and that no one else in the room had either. The vote when it came was not close. 31 people. 31 hands. The motion was worded precisely. Authorization to proceed with the Anathema Protocol, full deployment, all 41 designated targets, simultaneous activation. no language about proportionality, no language about civilian impact distinctions. Yenna had drafted the motion herself, and she had been deliberate about what it did not say. After the vote, no one spoke for almost 2 minutes. Then Vale opened his operations binder to the first blank page and began writing the production schedule. 41 Quelvar core worlds, combined population, 880 billion. The anathema seeds required to reach all 41 targets simultaneously, 1.4 million units. Current production capacity at facilities already converted, insufficient. Required conversion timeline to reach target production, 22 days. Days remaining before the Dominion's deadline, 39. The deadline the Dominion gave them was 47 days. They needed 31 to be ready. 16 days to spare. Vale did not write that last line, he already knew it. A logistics man does not write down what he already knows, he writes down what he needs to track. The 16 days were not a number that needed tracking. They were a margin. He was comfortable with margins. Engineer Chief Laura Das ran the production facility at Vassan Null, a converted asteroid belt installation that had spent 4 years processing nickel iron ore for habitat construction. The conversion from ore processing to anathema seed fabrication took 9 days. Das oversaw every hour of it personally. She walked every production line 3 times before it went active. She read every specification twice. She signed every manifest herself rather than delegating to her team leads, which was inefficient and which she did not explain to anyone and did not need to. The people who build a thing should know they built it. They should not be able to say later that they did not know what was on those lines. We knew, she would tell Thessenver 14 months after the deployment. Every person on every line knew that was the point. We made it the point. Das was not a person who embellished. Thessen noted in her report that Das had delivered that statement the way other people deliver weather updates. Accurate, brief, already moving on to the next item. By day 22, Vassan Null was producing 40,000 anathema seed units per day. The seeds were each smaller than a grain of sand. They were not, precisely speaking, mechanical, or rather, they were mechanical at the base layer and something more specific above it. Each unit contained a complete operational architecture. The instructions for consuming available matter and converting it into functional copies of itself. The communication protocols for sharing tactical updates across the full network in real time. The countermeasure libraries that Yenna had spent 6 years building for habitat construction, and had spent 6 weeks adapting for this. If a seed encountered a defense system that disrupted its replication cycle, it would identify the disruption, solve it, and transmit the solution to every other seed in range before it finished solving it. They could not be recalled after 72 hours of contact. Yenna had been precise about this. By day 29, total seed production across all converted facilities had reached 1.4 million units. 2 days ahead of schedule. Laura Das sent Vale a message at 300 that morning. The message contained a production figure and 2 words, ahead of schedule. Vale read it once, set it down, picked it up and read it again, did not reply, closed it, opened the operations binder to the current production schedule page and checked the number against his projections. He did not look at the inside cover. Captain Iron Mauve commanded what the official shipping records called the Vassan Null Export Convoy, a formation of 800 ore haulers ranging from 60,000 to 110,000 tons displacement. The manifests filed with the Dominion's commercial traffic monitoring system listed the cargo as processed mineral aggregate, bulk silicate, the kind of low-value raw material that fills transit lanes near asteroid belts and which no intelligence officer bothers to inspect. Each hauler carried between 40,000 and 80,000 anathema seed units in standard ore containers. Mauve briefed her captains once on the morning of day 31. She stood at the head of a room with 93 people in it. She had not prepared notes. She told them the dispersal coordinates, the deployment windows, and the return routes. She told them that after deployment, they were to maintain complete communication silence and proceed directly home on their pre-filed courses. She told them that the cargo would handle everything from the point of contact. Your job, she said, is to deliver the message. The message will speak for itself. She asked if anyone had questions. No one did. She dismissed them. The convoy launched 16 hours later. On Dominion surveillance logs, it registered as routine commercial traffic moving through the Pale Corridor, the broad dead zone of space between human territorial space and the nearest Quelvar transit lanes. A long-haul mineral shipment, nothing unusual about the tonnage or the formation. High-grade sensors might have flagged the container temperature profiles as slightly inconsistent with processed silicate aggregate. The Dominion's passive sensor array in that sector was not high-grade. It was adequate for monitoring civilian traffic in a region that had, until 11 months ago, been of no strategic significance. The convoy passed through without a query. Thessenver arrived at Threnic Deep on day 33. She had been told the briefing concerned supply chain infrastructure assessment. She had brought her recorder and a copy of the standard diplomatic observation protocols, which she had reviewed on the transit. She had noted, as the shuttle descended through Threnic Deep surface ice to the access tunnel, that the facility showed significantly more power draw than its inactive status would suggest. She had filed that observation and proceeded to the briefing. The room had 41 red circles on its display and 11 people who did not look up. Thesson watched the circles for 6 hours before she understood them. What she understood first, within the initial 40 minutes, as Vale moved through what she had assumed was a routine operations review, was that the production numbers being discussed were not consistent with any civilian infrastructure project she had encountered in 11 months of diplomatic work in human space. The scale was wrong. The specificity was wrong. Admiral Vorn's list was wrong, not in its existence but in the way he held it, the way a person holds an accounting rather than a reference document. What she understood second, around hour 3, when Yenna Sale gave a 12-minute status briefing in the precise, uninflected register of someone reporting technical compliance to technical specifications, was that the cargo that had departed Vassan Null 2 days earlier was not mineral aggregate. What she understood third, watching Vale Korath move through 6 hours of production reviews and deployment confirmations without once raising his voice, without once using language she would have called military, without once looking at the inside cover of the operations binder, was that this was not a desperate response. It was not improvised. It was not the action of a species that had panicked. It was the action of a species that had calculated. She wrote in her personal log that evening, "Humans do not, apparently, panic first and calculate second. They appear to run both processes simultaneously and then act on the calculation. I do not have a framework for this. I am not certain my species does either." She had attended 11 diplomatic briefings. She had a framework for 11 kinds of rooms. This was not the 12th kind. This was something without a number. At hour 6, Admiral Vorn looked up from the tactical display and said, with the specific economy of a man who does not repeat himself, "They've reached the dispersal perimeter." 41 red circles. The convoy had been in transit for 51 hours. Thesson looked at the circles. She thought about the forest rangers on 41 worlds who were about to notice something wrong. She thought about the specific shape of not knowing, which is the shape of every ordinary morning before the moment it stops being ordinary. She did not write that in her log. It was not, she decided, the kind of observation that belonged in a diplomatic report. She was not yet sure what kind of observation it was. The 41 red circles sat on the display, steady and bright, and the room was very quiet, and nobody celebrated, and the machines were already there. The first signal arrived 61 hours after the convoy passed through the pale corridor. It was not technically a distress signal. The Quelvar communication protocols had 17 distinct categories for emergency transmission, and what came through in those early hours did not fit any of them. What it was in the end was a ranger report from an interior forestry monitoring station on a world called Veth Quellan, a trade world, no military significance, population 400 million. The ranger's name was not in the transmission. What was in the transmission was a description. The trees on the eastern slope had turned gray. Not dead gray, not drought gray. Gray the way metal is gray. The ranger noted there was no sound. Birds had been present that morning. They were not present now. She requested guidance on whether to evacuate her monitoring post. No guidance was sent. The relay station that would have processed her request went silent 40 minutes later. Thessenver was still in the room at Threnic Deep when the first signal fragment reached the tactical display. She had been there for 8 hours by then. 3 of the 41 red circles had changed. They were not red anymore. She did not know the word the Covenant used for the new color. She wrote in her personal log that it was the color of something that had already happened. The Quelvar Dominion's intelligence core processed the first 14 signals as equipment malfunction. This was a reasonable assessment. The worlds in question were interior trade systems. They had no strategic significance. No adversary in the Dominion's threat models targeted interior trade worlds. There was no military logic for it, and the Dominion had spent 11,000 years building threat models around military logic. By the time the signals were correctly categorized, 14 worlds had gone silent. Investigation fleets were dispatched to the 3 nearest systems. Standard protocol, 2 vessels each, sensor sweep, preliminary assessment, report back within 72 hours. None of them reported back. Thesson watched Vale Korath during those hours. She had been watching him for most of the day. He moved through the room the way a person moves through a building they designed, not with authority exactly, but with the specific ease of someone who knows where every wall is without looking. He reviewed production reports. He confirmed deployment windows. He answered questions from Admiral Vorn in the clipped, minimum word register that she was beginning to understand was not curtness but efficiency. He did not look at the tactical display when the circles changed color. He already knew what the new color meant. He had been the one who chose it. At hour 9, Vorn looked up from the display and said, without preamble, "Investigation fleets are overdue." Vale said, "I know." Vorn said, "All three." Vale said, "I know." There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Vorn turned back to the display and made a notation on his handwritten list. He did not explain what the notation was. Thesson could not read it from across the room. She would learn later that every time a Quelvar vessel failed to report back, Vorn added a line to a separate column he had started on the back of his list. He was counting. He did not tell anyone he was counting. He did not need to. Counting was something you did because you needed to know the number, not because anyone had asked you for it. The Quelvar Dominion's first accurate assessment of the situation reached Paramount Director Solveth Ron 91 hours after dispersal. His intelligence chief did not use preamble. She had served Ron for 19 years and had learned that he did not want her to soften what she had found. She presented the analysis as she had found it. The attack had originated from human space. The weapon was self-replicating at an exponential rate. Every interdiction method the Dominion had attempted had failed to demonstrate effectiveness. The swarm adapted to countermeasures in real time and distributed the solution across the full network before the countermeasure finished executing. At current growth projections, assuming no additional deployment from human territory, the swarm would reach Dominion total population equivalent within 19 months. Ron reviewed the document. He read it the way he read everything, completely, without interruption, from the first line to the last. Then he read it again. He asked one question. Did they attempt to communicate terms? His intelligence chief said, "No, Paramount Director." Ron did not speak for 4 minutes. The intelligence chief did not move. She had learned that his silences were working, not empty, that he was doing something in them, not waiting for something. When he spoke, he said, "Then they are not fighting our war." She did not understand what he meant. He did not explain. In a transit authority office on Quelvar Dominion, one of the 23 worlds that had not yet gone silent, a mid-tier administrative hub, population 1.2 billion, a scheduling coordinator named Oveth Kaz had a habit she had developed over 30 years of shift work. On her days off, she still came in to check the arrival boards, not because she needed to. Because the boards had a particular quality of orderliness that she found settling, the precise rhythm of arrivals and departures, everything in its column, everything on time or noted as delayed. It was the most organized thing she knew. She came in that morning at the start of what would have been her shift. She stood in front of the primary arrival board in the transit hub's main concourse. The board showed 17 inbound vessels, 6 scheduled departures, and 2 delayed arrivals from the Vethquelin relay. The Vethquelin relay notation updated while she was reading it. The update replaced the delay notation with a single word she had not seen on an arrival board before. The word was unresponsive. She stood looking at it. The board updated again 11 minutes later. A second relay went unresponsive, then a third. She was still standing there when the gray reached her district. It came from the south across the lower city, and it moved the way weather moves, steadily, without hurry, covering everything it touched. She noted that it made no sound. She noted that it was very thorough. The arrival board was still updating when it reached the transit hub. The last notation it made, before the power systems converted into something that was no longer power systems, was a departure time for a vessel that had already left. Oveth Kaz did not survive the gray. None of the 1.2 billion people on Quelvar Dominion did. Thesson Ver would find her name in a Dominion administrative census 14 months later while compiling population data for the appendices of her report. She noted it in a personal log entry that she did not include in the report. The entry said only, she was checking the arrival boards. Thesson did not know in the room at Threnic Deep about Oveth Kaz. She did not know the names of anyone on the worlds whose circles were changing color. She was watching the display because it was the thing in the room that was honest about what was happening, and she needed something in the room to be honest about it. She had been quiet for 9 hours. She looked at Admiral Vorn. He was standing at the display with his list, adding a line to the back column. She said, "Is there a termination code?" Vorn looked at Vale. Vale did not look up from the operations binder. He said, "Yes." He did not say anything else. He turned a page in the binder. He began reading the next section. Thesson wrote in her personal log in very small script at the bottom of the page. He said yes. He did not say whether it had been entered. I did not ask. I think I already knew the answer and did not want it confirmed in a room with 11 people watching the display. She did not ask again. No one in the room asked. She would think about that for a long time afterward, the specific shape of a question that everyone in the room already knew the answer to, and that no one asked because asking would have required them to make the answer exist outside of themselves. The anathema protocol had been designed with a 72-hour termination window. Yenna Sale had been precise about it. The window had closed 81 hours after first contact. No one had entered the codes. Paramount Director Solvath Ron transmitted directly to Vale Korath on day 39 of what the Dominion had called its compliance window. The transmission was routed through 3 neutral relay stations and arrived at Threnic Deep with a 14-hour lag. Ron had recorded it in his private office, which was a room Thesson would never see but would reconstruct from 4 different accounts. A room of layered pale stone, no windows, a single desk, a wall of administrative seals representing 11,000 years of Dominion governance. He had sat at the desk. He had not worn his authority seal for the recording. He was composed. He did not make demands. He did not offer concessions. He did not ask for terms. He said, I want you to know that I understand now what you're doing and why you are doing it. I made a decision 11 months ago that I believed was administratively necessary. I had a problem of civilizational compliance, and I applied the tool appropriate to that category of problem, and I treated your species as an instance of that category. I want you to know that I no longer make that error. He paused. The pause was approximately 8 seconds. On the recording, you could hear the ventilation in his office, a very faint, very steady sound. I want you to know that there is no version of this conversation in which I ask you to stop. I understand that you will not stop. I am not speaking to request that you stop. I am speaking because I think someone should say, before there is no one left to say it, we were wrong to do what we did. You were right to answer the way you answered. Neither of those things makes what comes next less terrible, and I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. He looked directly into the recording lens for the last 3 seconds. His rectangular pupils were fully dilated. He said, I think you already knew we were wrong. I think you knew before you built it. I think that is why you built it the way you did. The transmission ended. Vale watched it once. He did not replay it. He sat for approximately 40 seconds after it ended, not moving, not looking at anything in the room. Then he stood up, walked to the doorway of his equipment bay, and called for Vorn. He presented the transmission to the full Covenant leadership in 2 sentences. The transmission was received. The Paramount Director had acknowledged the Dominion's error and made no request for terms. He asked if anyone wanted to consider a response. Admiral Vorn said, the machines are already there. No one else spoke. Vale closed the briefing. The seeds did not distinguish between military installations and residential districts. They had not been designed to. That had been a choice made by 31 people in a room that smelled like recycled air and old ore processing equipment, and every one of those 31 people had raised their hand, and not one of them, in the months that followed, ever said they had not known what the choice meant. They had known. They had made it the point to know. Thesson wrote in her log that evening. Ron said neither of those things makes what comes next less terrible. I have been thinking about the word neither. He was not describing 2 things. He was describing one thing that exists in 2 registers simultaneously, the wrongness of what the Dominion did and the rightness of what the Covenant did, and saying that the simultaneous truth of both of them does not reduce the weight of what comes next. I don't have a framework for a species that can hold both of those things at the same time and still issue a production schedule. I am not sure the framework exists. She stopped writing. She looked at the tactical display. 31 circles had changed color. She wrote one more word in her log and closed it. Vale Korath had stopped trying to sleep before 506 weeks into the operation. Between 300 and 500, the operations binder was open and the room was quiet, and he worked through whatever needed working through. It was not insomnia in the clinical sense. He simply did not see the value in lying horizontal when there were production schedules to review. At 3:47 on day 41, he was rereading the previous day's deployment confirmation summary. He already knew the numbers. He had written them himself. He read them anyway because reading a number you already know is a different act than knowing it. It makes the number exist outside of you, on the page, in the light, real in a way that memory is not quite real. The door to his equipment bay opened. Admiral Vorn stood in the doorway. This was unusual. Vorn communicated by terminal when the information was not time-sensitive. He communicated in person when it was. He was holding a single printed page. This was also unusual. Vorn did not print things. He kept his records in handwritten lists. He had said once early in the operation that printed documents feel like they belong to an institution, and the Covenant was not yet an institution. It was 31 people making decisions that would either work or not work, and he preferred the documents to reflect that. He was holding a printed page. Vale set down the deployment summary. Vorn entered the room. He stood at the edge of the desk. He read from the page in his specific declarative register, no subordinate clauses, no hedging. Quelvar Prime stellar mass detonated at 219 Covenant standard. Estimated effect radius, 60 billion kilometers. Anathema fleet losses in the Quelvar Prime system, 140,000 vessels destroyed. Quelvar Prime system, total loss. Confirmed Quelvar civilian casualties from stellar detonation, estimated 19 billion. Vale listened. He did not write anything. Vorn said they destroyed more of their own people than we had deployed ships in that system. Vale said, I know. Vorn said the machines will replace the lost vessels. Vale said, I know. There was a pause. Vorn looked at the page. He said, the replacement timeline. Vale said 11 days. Vorn had not told him the timeline. He did not ask how Vale knew. He already understood. Vale had calculated it 3 weeks ago in a contingency table on a page near the back of the operations binder for exactly this scenario. A logistics man builds contingency tables. A logistics man is never surprised by a number he has already calculated. Vorn set the printed page on the edge of the desk. He did not leave. He stood in the doorway and said, not to Vale specifically, not to anyone in particular, the way a person speaks when they are not asking for a response but need to hear the sentence exist outside of themselves. He was trying to hurt us. Vale said he was trying to make it cost something. He wanted it to cost something. Vorn said it cost something. Vale said yes. The silence that followed was long enough that it became its own kind of answer. It lasted 11 seconds. Thessin Ver, who had fallen asleep in her chair at the back of the room and woken at the sound of Vorn entering, timed it on her recorder without knowing why. Then Vale opened the operations binder to the current page. He did not look at the inside cover. He began the 347 review. Vorn left. The machines did not stop. No one had told them to. Thessin went back to her chair. She did not sleep again. She opened her personal log and looked at the single word she had written the night before after Ron's transmission after 31 circles had changed color. She read it once. She did not add to it. She closed the log. The word was the sentence she would write 14 months later, at the end of 14 pages and 3 appendices, in a notation her supervisors would flag as inappropriate for formal documentation. She already knew she would not remove it. The Quelvar Dominion's formal dissolution notice arrived at Threnic Deep 22 days after the stellar detonation. It was 3 sentences. The first acknowledged the end of Dominion governance authority over all claimed territories, effective immediately. The second requested safe passage for civilian remnant populations to neutral space, under any terms the Covenant found acceptable. The third sentence contained no apology. It stated only that the Dominion's administrative record, 11,000 years of it, would be transmitted to the neutral archive at Vesson Station for historical preservation. The transmission was addressed to no specific recipient. Vale issued the safe passage authorization alone between 347 and 500 and did not tell anyone until morning. He wrote it in the operations binder on the current page, in the same handwriting as the production schedules and deployment confirmations. It was 3 lines. He did not give it a separate section. The official Human Government Surrender Committee chair transmitted a message to Threnic Deep the following morning. The committee had been in its 41st session when word arrived that the Dominion no longer existed as a negotiating party. The message from the chair contained 1 sentence, "What have you done?" It was not phrased as a question. Vale read it. He set his terminal down. He did not respond. He had no answer that would fit inside a transmission, not because the answer was complicated, but because the question was the kind that does not actually want an answer. It wants an acknowledgement that the thing that was done cannot be undone. He already knew that. He had known it since the vote. Within 72 hours of the dissolution notice, the Vethani remnant opened formal diplomatic contact with the Terran Covenant. The communication was warm and brief and carefully worded in a way that acknowledged nothing the Vethani had or had not done during the preceding months. Thessin Ver, who was still at Threnic Deep, still technically on assignment, observed the communication from the back of the room. She wrote in her log, "They chose the correct moment to arrive. I cannot decide if I respect that or find it contemptible. Possibly both. Probably both. I think my species has always been very good at arriving after the work is done." She requested a formal interview with Vale Korath for her diplomatic reports. He agreed. She came prepared with 17 questions, which she had organized into 3 categories: operational, contextual, and personal. He answered 16 of them. The operational questions he answered with the same minimum word precision he used for everything else. The contextual questions he answered in slightly longer sentences, occasionally referencing a figure from the operations binder, which he kept open on the desk throughout the interview but did not look at while he was speaking. The personal questions he answered the way a man answers questions he has already settled for himself, without hesitation, without qualification, with the specific flatness of someone who made a decision a long time ago and has not reopened it. The 17th question was the last one she asked. She said, "Was there a moment when you considered stopping?" Vale looked at the operations binder. He did not open it. His left hand rested flat on the cover, the same way it had been resting on the cover the first time she saw him 8 weeks ago when she had not yet known what was in it. He said, "Next question." She had no more questions. She ended the interview. She thanked him for his time. He nodded. He opened the operations binder to the current page and began reading before she had finished standing up. She did not look back. She was not sure what she would have seen if she had. The Covenant record in the months that followed was asked many times whether humanity had won. The question came from other species, from human government officials, from historians who had begun the work of documenting what had happened. The Covenant did not disagree with the premise of the question. They understood what the word meant. They did not know how to answer it in a way that felt honest. What they said eventually in the only official statement they released was this: the threat was stopped. They did not use the word victory. They did not use the word justified. They used the word stopped, and they left the rest of it to whoever came after. The Quelvar count had no operations binder. There was no one left to write it. That was the difference, and Vale knew it and did not feel what he had expected to feel. Thessenver completed her diplomatic report 14 months after the events at Threnic Deep. It was 14 pages long with 3 appendices. One containing population data, one containing a timeline of transmissions, one containing a glossary of Covenant operational terminology that she had compiled herself because no official glossary existed. Her supervisors reviewed the report. They approved it with 2 revisions. They flagged one sentence in the final paragraph as inappropriate for formal documentation, subjective, they noted, and outside the scope of a diplomatic observer's mandate. She read their note, she considered the sentence, she left it in. The report was filed, the appendices were attached, the sentence remained. They did not celebrate. She had been watching. They did not celebrate at all.